Hi, Neil here, and welcome back. This is a prior lesson recap. We're going to go over the last 5 weeks in 5 minutes. Let's see what we can do here. Now, I introduce you to this big wheel just to give you a big picture of the whole unit, Global Supply Chain Management. And we're up to about the third part of this big giant wheel, and we're going to get to that in 5 minutes. We started off giving you an insight of the total situation that's happening in the world, especially the last 18 months, preceded by the trade war, which is ongoing, and also multiplied by the pandemic with border closures, gyrations of supply and demand, which is causing a lot of bottlenecks right throughout the global supply chain. And so we looked at those macro risks, and it's very, very interesting that the challenges that we looked at, and we looked at the panel discussion I had with the Global Supply Chain Council with other members when they were talking about what is most important. It was communication, it was visibility, it was just more frequent communication. Someone said the culture was important, and I said it was very important to have third-party inspectors on the other side of the border that you cannot get across to go into the factory on your behalf. And there were so many things that we were thinking about that is brought on by the pandemic, the trade war, and these gyrations between supply and demand, which is just so much out of balance. And there's so much uncertainty, not just for multinationals, but for SMEs, which is actually forcing many SMEs to actually close up, move out of a country, not even move to another country, or changing the way in which SMEs design their products so they're not reliant on one particular country. For the multinationals, they can manage this like a portfolio, and so move a little bit of capacity from this country to another country. And that's what we learned when we moved into week 2. We started realizing that, wow, 108 publicly documented companies have actually moved out of China into other countries and actually planned moves between 2018 to 2023. Out of 108, 54, that is 50% of those companies have actually moved capacity down to Vietnam. Wow! And about 36 of them have moved to Vietnam, already have existing capacity there, showing you that it's so much easier to move capacity from one country to another if you already have a portfolio of countries that you are sourcing from. And so we got this idea of the red ocean strategy, the blue ocean strategy. And the blue ocean strategy was where you move to a country for the first time. And we saw that with Malaysia, with more of those 7 companies that moved capacity in Malaysia were going there for the first time. Wow. And so that's what we covered in week 2. And it's so interesting to see this sourcing shift that is going on. In week 3, we went from macro down to operational. So what does that mean? Well, now, look, Global supply chain management means that there are suppliers that you are partnering with at some point in time in the supply chain. So there are other partners you need to partner. So if you want to be successful partnering them, then you need to understand what are their motivations and how they make money. What are their business models? And if you just put undue pressure on them all the time by saying, can you get cheaper, 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 they're going to do something without you knowing, because there's information asymmetry. They know something that you don't know. You're on the other side of the world. You cannot observe them 24 hours a day. And so what we learned in week 3 was that suppliers can do some awesomely risky things that can, in some way, cheat how the product is delivered to you. They could actually copy ideas from other suppliers, or actually go and actually get axles from another supplier of one of the major brand name competitors. Wow, they could outsource, they could put cheaper materials into your product and get you into trouble. That's what happened to the melamine milk. That's what happened to Mattel over a decade ago, where the lead paint was going into the toys. Wow, you wouldn't want to be touching that toy with your lips, would you? Cheaper labor is another thing, and that's high on the agenda of many boards of directors around the world today with the human rights interests. And so ultimately with this supply competitive market model, you want to get to a stage where you want to work with a supplier to get process improvement going on. Yes, you know that. That was the car. How come Cherry QQ can be cheaper than the Spark? They went to the supplier of the competitor and asked them, oh, you're doing 100,000 run of their axles. How about you do 20,000 more? We pay you marginal costs. Yes, that's how you do it when you put pressure on your supplier and you don't have full information to monitor, full visibility. And visibility is what multinationals are crying out for today. Then we go into week 4, and then week 4 was the D-Day for all of you, and you know that because you had to submit your RFQ, request for quotation, and I know you did a lot of work, 3, 4, 5 hours, 1 day, 2 day, contacting many suppliers to find one supplier who would agree to give you a quotation on your tablet, right? And you had to go through a litany of questions. And that's what the first part of the 3-circle control framework is about, is to try and keep you unbiased, objective, and on your game to make sure that you maximize or optimize what you're getting out of that relationship with the supplier. So you had a list of questions to cover with your request for quotation. And it wasn't about getting the best relationship for you, you're just getting an arm's length deal with that request for quotation. And that the first circle starts with this list of questions about what is it about your product that you are looking for. And it keeps you objective, keeps you on your game. Moving a little bit further in week 4, we start to realize, well, hang on, if you want to order a second time and a third time, and you want to make sure that the supplier is still there, a second time, a third time, you want to make sure the supplier doesn't put its price up by 20%, 30% on the second time, third time. You've got to think ahead, all right, and find out what is that supplier really like beyond giving you a cheap price product. And this is the really important part of week 4, where we looked at negotiation strategy, where you look beyond the price and you look towards joint value creation, and that was so critical as we covered that in week 4. And there we had our request for quotation. That was an interesting exercise where you went through and we compared all 27 quotations which every one of you got, and then as a group you picked out the best quotations. Now you didn't get extra marks if you got picked out, but just want to show you the information overload that occurs if you don't properly plan the list of requirements that you're looking for when you're going out to get requests for quotations from various suppliers, because at the end of the day you want to have an apples to apples comparison. And then what we did in week 4, we introduced to you to the operational side of the supplier's business. And that is where you go into the factory, what should you look for? You've got to look for clean rooms. Dust is an enemy of electronics. You wouldn't eat your food off the floor. Why? Because of dust and dirt, and let alone bacteria and all that sort of stuff. But the same thing in a good electronics factory. You need to have anti-static pads. You need to have proper ergonomics for the workers in the factory. There are a litany of things to look for when you go and look at the supplier's factory that gives you the telltale signs that the supplier is a good supplier or a bad supplier. The telltale signs that is the supplier going to be around in 12 months' time, or is the supplier likely to go bankrupt? Because you can see that the way they are doing things, it's obviously they are taking shortcuts. And so we've got this list of items here to look in that factory to better understand who is this partner that you are transacting with. Who is this partner that you want to have a relationship with over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years? And that's what it's so critical as part of the supply chain that you understand the basics of what to look for when you go into the factory. And so in weeks 6, 7, and 8, all of you in your presentations will actually be presenting your observations and reflections on looking at the videos of factories that I have visited. And so what we did in week 5, we came to the second circle of the 3-circle control framework. And that was all about the lawyer. Yes, the law, documentation, and this is the contract. And remember, the big idea in that week 5 was that, yes, you need to have a contract, but the contract will not really protect you. In other words, don't have a contract for the point of view that, well, if the supplier slips up or they do something wrong, I'll take him to court. That's not going to happen in the international setting at a cheap price. So you do have to have a contract. And we found that out when we looked at the supplier blacklist to see that contracts were negatively related to the propensity or the likelihood that you would be subject to a fraud. That is, the supplier sends you a box of rocks or they take your money and you never hear about the supplier again. So you do need to have a contract, but the contract will not save you. O'Connor, well, why do we have contracts for? Contracts is to set out the expectations of you and your partner. Make it very, very clear from the get-go. It's a basis, it's a foundation for the relationship. Of course, you've got to have other give and takes in the relationship, get to know one another, try and help the supplier in many other ways, but a contract is a starting point too. And that was very important in the second circle. Next week in week 6, we're going to look at the third circle, all right? But that's next week. This is supposed to be a 5-minute summary, and I think I've gone over 5 minutes now, but let's finish this up. Now, remember, the last idea I gave you was this notion of scam. Yes, you see it just above me here, the scam, all right? Scam. And what was the scam? You know, if you want to scam a buyer as a supplier, what do? You take out some of the milliamp hour batteries in your power bank and you replace it with sand. Yes. Why do you do that? Because you want to keep the power bank the same weight. So when it goes to shipping, customs, FOB, when they weigh all the products, the buyer doesn't know any difference that you have scammed the buyer with that shoddy product. Yeah. We have to teach you how to scam someone for you to appreciate how easy it is for you to be scammed. And so we looked at that in week 5. We looked at the supplier blacklist and the evidence that we got from that. And it was all about, if you want to minimize the chances that you were going to be subject to a fraud, then you needed to verify who is a supplier you are supplying from. You need to visit the supplier's factory. You need to have a third-party audit undertaken on the product that you are sourcing. There are many items empirically demonstrating the importance of these governance items, including the contract. But the contract's not going to save you, all right? But you still need to have a contract, all right? And then finally, the contracts and payments, what can go wrong? Of course, it will not save you, but that was what week 5 was about. And so finally, intellectual property, which actually dovetails into week 6. But there we have it. There's our 5 weeks in 5 minutes, plus probably another 5 minutes. But I just want you to get a sense that global supply chain management is more than just sourcing domestically. It's more than sourcing from just one supplier. You are going international and you are working with suppliers most likely in developing countries. Why? Because you're taking advantage of the cheap labor. You're taking advantage of different ecosystems. So therefore, you are out of touch. There is an information asymmetry between you and the supplier. There is a visibility that you're yearning for, that you'd like to have, that you have domestically, but you're not going to get that internationally unless you have people on the ground in the supplier's country. And these are the issues that are being exacerbated today because of border closures. So thank you so much for your great efforts in this wonderful unit so far. I look forward to seeing you in class in week 6. Stay tuned and watch out for the next supplier. Bye for now.